Vegans are usually motivated by at least one of three things: the environment, ethics, or their health. The first two motivations may be justified. After all, there is evidence that meat and dairy production fuels climate change, and it's quite hard to defend the practices of the factory farming industry. But what about health? Eating more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and other plant-based foods is good for your health, sure, but you don't need to be a vegan to eat those foods. Those foods are accessible to everyone. Instead, veganism is a diet of limitation, specifically a limitation of animal products. It implies that all animal products, from red, white, and processed meat to cheese, yogurt, and milk, are in some way harmful. But what does the science say? It's pretty much settled science that meat and dairy, particularly fish and organ meat, is some of the most nutritious food on the planet. But the health risks of eating animal products are less clear. We've been told for decades that saturated fat causes heart attacks, diabetes, and other chronic diseases.
Saturated fat has long been seen as one of the villains of the British diet.
But this theory may actually be false. Most modern science suggests that animal products are generally harmless. On the other hand, research shows that vegans who do not rigorously plan their diet are at major risks of nutrient deficiencies. In particular, plant-based diets are low in B vitamins, iron, zinc, and selenium, as well as omega-3 fatty acids. Such deficiencies can lead to a multitude of problems, including reduced brain development, infertility, and long-term fatigue. In short, it appears that meat and dairy still has a place in a healthy diet, albeit one mostly filled with fruits and vegetables. Those who have switched to veganism for health reasons alone may have been misled. But before you turn off the video, let me explain. Before we can even think about whether a vegan diet is healthy or not, there are two things that you need to understand. First, that the study of nutrition is still young. We've been able to fly planes longer than we've understood anything meaningful about nutrition. Since then, we've pretty much identified all vitamins and minerals, as well as the role that they play in human health, but there are still many mysteries to be unraveled. In particular, we don't know how our diets contribute to long-term chronic diseases, such as type 2 diabetes and heart disease. Much of the proven science out there is, well, anything but proven. This is the second point you need to understand. In nutrition, there are two kinds of research: epidemiological and randomized clinical trials, otherwise known as RCTs. An epidemiological study is observational. Researchers study a large group of people over a long period of time as they live out their normal lives. They gather data like what they eat, how much they exercise, and whether or not they smoke cigarettes. They then correlate that data with the health conditions that they develop over time. Let's say a researcher wants to prove that meat consumption leads to heart disease. To do that, the researcher will examine all of those people who got heart disease, and they'll look at their diets. What did they eat? Did they eat a lot of meat? How often did they eat meat? If, say, 90% of people who got heart disease ate red meat daily, and those who didn't usually eat red meat didn't get heart disease, that indicates a pretty strong correlation between red meat consumption and heart disease. Although that seems like a pretty convincing argument, it's essential to understand that correlation does not prove causation. For instance, those same 90% of participants who ate red meat daily may also never exercise. They might smoke 20 cigarettes a day and also eat sugary and processed food alongside red meat. Any of those other correlations could also be responsible for heart disease. This is why observational studies can never prove an argument. They're great for generating hypotheses, that is, educated assumptions, but they can never, ever prove them. To prove a hypothesis, the researcher must conduct a randomized clinical trial. But that isn't easy to do. RCTs are exorbitantly expensive, massively time-consuming, and require large participation as well as dedication from those who actually do participate. I mean, think about it. Let's say, for example, you wanted to identify whether red meat causes a long-term disease like type 2 diabetes. Well, first, you'd need a large enough data set to provide some sort of meaningful insight. In other words, you need a lot of people. You then need to ensure that half of the participants continue to eat the diet that they're eating now, which may be heavy in red meat, and you need to make sure that half of the participants avoided red meat, so that you could see the difference that develops over time. You then need to study them long enough to actually see these diseases develop, and in most cases, this takes literally decades. The difficulty in setting up an RCT, funding it, and running it long enough to provide useful data is immense. This is why most of the research that we hear about is actually based on observational research. But this is something that we'll come back to. For now, let's go back to the question. Is a vegan diet actually healthy? There's a handful of observational studies and even a few small RCTs that explore how vegan diets impact health and disease. The research suggests that a vegan diet may lead to lower cholesterol, lower blood pressure, and increased weight loss, as well as other positive health markers. But exploring the benefits of specific vegan diets isn't useful. That data simply can't tell us whether veganism in general is actually healthy or not. Alright, let's say we've got two hypothetical vegans, Donald and Rebecca. Donald eats mainly whole foods, leafy greens, fruit, some root vegetables, whole grains, tofu and things like that, whereas meat, milk, eggs and anything else from another living creature repulses him. Rebecca, she feels the same way about animal products, but she's equally repulsed by leafy greens and whole grains. Instead, what she eats is mainly processed food, so vegan chicken nuggets, deep fried tofu burgers, vegan cheese, crisps, chocolate, and things of that nature. The only parallel between Donald and Rebecca's diet is the single element that ties together all vegans: the exclusion of animal products. Veganism is not a diet of recommendation, it's a diet of limitation. We already know fruit and vegetables are healthy, and besides, there's no reason an omnivore can't eat just as many plant-based products as a vegan. Any health benefits that a vegan gets from a plant-based diet is also accessible to an omnivore. If we want to determine whether or not veganism is actually healthy, we shouldn't consider what they do eat, but rather the implications of the things that they don't eat. In other words, we need to identify the benefits and the risks of giving up meat and dairy. The world is inundated with articles and documentaries promoting the various health benefits of a diet low in meat and dairy. But what does the science say? In 2015, the World Health Organization rounded up 22 researchers from 10 different countries to evaluate 800 epidemiological studies. They wanted to answer the question, does red and processed meat cause cancer? And so what did they conclude in the end?
Processed meat has been classified as carcinogenic along with other well-known substances including tobacco smoking and asbestos.
That sounds pretty intense, but the evidence isn't actually as solid as you might expect.
And I have first-hand experience 3 years ago, having been on the World Health Organization working group that evaluated processed and red meat and risk of cancer. That was the most frustrating professional experience of my life.
That was Dr. Klurfeld on a podcast discussing his experience as one of the 22 scientists on the World Health Organization's working group. The first thing Klurfeld noted is that the data only indicates a higher risk of colon cancer specifically. The evidence supporting the increased risk of other cancers is non-existent or inconclusive. And it gets worse. 14 of those studies were related to red meat, and 18 were related to processed meat. Incredibly, only 7 of the 14 red meat studies and only 12 of the 18 processed meat studies indicated any increased risk of cancer. And remember, all of those studies were observational. They cannot, by their very nature, prove causation. They can only indicate correlation. Sure, red meat could cause colon cancer, but it could also be that those who eat red meat also eat sugary processed foods over fruit and vegetables, smoke cigarettes and don't exercise enough. So red meat might very well cause cancer, but that is far from proven fact. But what about meat and dairy's role in chronic disease such as diabetes and heart disease? After World War II ended, the Western world faced epidemic rates of chronic disease, including heart disease. Thousands of middle-aged, seemingly healthy people began to die daily from heart attacks and strokes, and nobody knew why. The world pined for an explanation. Then came American physiologist Ancel Keys. In 1955, he presented a theory to the World Health Organization. He told them that saturated fat, which is found in almost all meat and dairy products, is the problem. Eat less saturated fat, he argued, and we'll see less cases of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and pretty much any other chronic disease plaguing the Western world. And his ideas fell on keen ears. The diet heart hypothesis, as it came to be known, came from Keys' famous 7 Nations study. The study explored the dietary habits of people from 7 nations across the world and found a correlation between chronic disease and meat consumption. But the study had several major issues. For one, he intentionally omitted nations whose dietary habits failed to show a correlation between meat consumption and chronic disease. For another thing, he studied some of the nations during Lent, a religious period when people would have consumed far less meat, thus showing an inaccurate correlation between meat consumption and chronic disease. And all of the data in this study is epidemiological, i.e. observational. In any case, his evidence, coupled with his charisma, took hold in the US and even landed him a place on the cover of Time magazine. Soon, the American Heart Association, and later the United States government itself, adopted the hypothesis as official policy. In a 1977 publication called Dietary Goals, the United States government made official recommendations that the entire US population adopt a low-fat diet in order to reduce their saturated fat consumption. Although many in the research community proposed alternative hypotheses, they were brushed aside as the diet-heart hypothesis became enshrined as common sense within and outside of the scientific community. The rest of the world followed the US, advocating a low-fat diet of their citizens and forming a theoretical house of cards built on a theory. Because, by definition, that's all a hypothesis actually is. It's a theory. And a theory must be proven. So what actually happened when the theory literally got put on trial? In RCT after RCT, saturated fat has been exonerated. There has been no evidence to show that saturated fat is harmful. And yet this perception that saturated fat is dangerous continues. It's ingrained in our collective mindset. The diet-heart hypothesis is the reason doctors tell us to keep our cholesterol low. It's the reason that supermarkets are flooded with low-fat products. And it's why other potentially more dangerous products, for example sugar, have gotten off the hook. There are no doubt other arguments against meat, but many are based on these aforementioned points or have equally little scientific grounding. In short, there's pretty much little conclusive evidence proving that meat is dangerous. But is it possible that giving up meat and dairy is actually dangerous? Though anthropologists debate whether our ancient ancestors ate meat, there is little doubt our recent ancestors, such as the Romans, ate meat and dairy alongside fruit and vegetables. For instance, we know some Roman soldiers ate pies stuffed with honey and goat's cheese, and that many ancient tribes that still thrive today, such as the Inuit and the Maasai, ate and still eat meat exclusively. And truth be told, they don't look too bad. These fellas can dance better than me. Though truth be told, that isn't very difficult. Even in the Western world, there's little doubt that meat has been a staple for a long, long while. If you spend a winter in the United Kingdom, the historic need for meat becomes apparent. The UK winter is harsh and cold, and only the strongest and hardiest vegetables can survive and grow. That means that not much beyond cabbage, kale and potatoes grows at this time of year. Most of the fruit and vegetables we have available are imported from abroad. But my British ancestors, they didn't have access to freights or freezers. They may have traded with other Europeans who had access to better crops, but it's likely only the rich lords would have had that luxury. It's unlikely that the typical peasant enjoyed grapes and spinach from France or Spain. Further still, before the Columbian Exchange in the late 15th century, when Columbus discovered the Americas, the fruits and vegetables available in Europe were much more limited. Most of the fruits and vegetables we enjoy today had never been seen by Europeans, Asians or Africans until Columbus brought them back with him. Tomatoes, potatoes, corn, avocados, squash, peanuts, strawberries and many other fruits and vegetables were completely unknown before the late 15th century. If you think it's tough being a vegan now, imagine how it must have felt during winter in medieval Europe. No, during winter, it's more likely that pulses and legumes that had been harvested in summer and dried out made up the typical European fare. Your typical peasant would have then supplemented that with meat. Every peasant had at least one pig, says Colin Spencer in his book British Food, which would have been slaughtered in November and salted down for the year. That means that not only did they eat meat, but they even ate processed meat to boot. The lack of vegetation in winter is also why cheese in particular is a useful foodstuff. Peasants could milk the cows in summer and turn the milk into cheese that could be consumed in winter as and when needed. But things have changed. We do have freights and freezers now. Does meat and dairy have a place in the modern Western diet? Although many plant-based foods are very nutritious, some of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet are actually animal products. Consider liver, for example. The liver is used to store vitamins, glucose, iron, and other essential nutrients. So naturally, this organ meat is particularly nutritious. Organ meat, or offal, is generally more nutritious than the muscle meat that we typically consume. Cheese, milk, and dairy is also generally written off as unhealthy, but they're all great sources of complete proteins. That is, they provide all the essential amino acids that a human body needs to survive, whereas most plant sources do not, as well as every other vitamin and mineral that the human body needs. But what about muscle meat? chicken breasts, beef steak and pork chops. Well, the very same World Health Organization report that categorized red and processed meat as potentially carcinogenic also noted that red meat is nutritious. It's also a complete source of protein and contains many important micronutrients such as B vitamins, iron and zinc. And when it comes to fish, the evidence is even more compelling. In one study, 5 scientists examined over 1,000 foods and assigned each food a nutritional score. The higher the score, the more likely the food is to meet but not exceed your daily nutritional needs. 26 of the top 100 foods were animal-based products, and most were fish. Pork fat, for instance, surprisingly had a nutritional score of 73, while flatfish and ocean perch scored 88 and 89 respectively. Of course, the other 74 foods were plant foods, which are also highly nutritious. I am not for 1 second arguing that plant-based foods are not nutritious. Like I said earlier, we already know that fruit and vegetables are healthy. The problem is that veganism insinuates, through its extreme exclusion of all products derived from animals, that animal products are all in some way harmful. But if we consider veganism exclusively from a health perspective, given that we know that at least some animal products are more nutritious than most plant-based products, why would we give them up? And yet, this is exactly the course of action that veganism prescribes. Worse still, instead of replacing meat and dairy in the diet with natural plant-based alternatives, such as legumes, pulses, grains and vegetables, many opt for so-called ersatz foods that emulate meat and dairy. Meat is swapped out for meat-like products made from soy, jackfruit, which is particularly nutritionally poor, containing virtually no protein, and whatever corn is. Cheese is replaced by vegan substitutes, which come in a variety of styles. While those made from vegetables and nuts are relatively nutritious, nearly all vegan cheese, made in the UK at least, is made from coconut oil mixed with starch. This is particularly ironic, given that many people switch to a vegan diet based on the notion that saturated fat is harmful, while coconut oil actually contains double the saturated fat of beef dripping. In any case, while companies have done a fantastic job emulating the experience of eating meat, that is, the aesthetic, the texture, and the taste, these products are generally less nutritious. Most of these substitutes contain less vitamins and minerals, and vegan cheese is pretty much just carbohydrates and fat. It's also worth remembering that veganism itself is a relatively new concept. As we've already talked about, humans have eaten meat for thousands of years, whereas veganism has been around for a few decades at most. These ersatz meat substitutes are equally new, and there's little research evaluating their long-term health effects. We simply don't know what happens to the human body after, say, 20 years of eating corn chicken. However, we do know that when someone gives up meat and dairy, they put themselves at great risk of nutritional deficiencies. One scientific review found that vegans tended to have lower intakes of vitamins B2, B3, B12 and D, as well as iodine, zinc, calcium, potassium and selenium. Another study also indicated a lower intake of omega-3 fatty acids. All of these vitamins and minerals are harder, albeit not impossible, to find in plant-based foods. A vegan can avoid micronutrient deficiencies, but their diet must be rigorously planned. These nutrients and minerals can be found in fortified foods, such as nutritional yeast and some dairy-free milks and cereals, as well as supplements. But is it enough? Remember, the study of nutrition is young. We may not actually fully understand everything that the human body and the human brain needs for healthy development. There are so many unknowns, says Nathan Kofnas, a co-author of a study exploring the impact of a vegan diet on health and the brain. There may be nutrients available exclusively in animal products that are essential to our health. When you deviate from the typical diet for your species to one which has not been tested and properly established to be healthy or good for the brain, you are conducting an experiment and you are taking a risk. Moreover, there's a difference between the nutrients you actually consume and what your body actually absorbs. For example, if you consume 10 milligrams of iron, your body may only absorb 5 milligrams of that. As it turns out, the iron found in plant-based foods is not as easy for the body to absorb as the iron from animal products. So if a vegan and an omnivore consume equal proportions of vitamins and minerals, such as iron, the omnivore is likely to be absorbing more. Micronutrient deficiency can have detrimental effects, from inhibited brain development and infertility to long-term fatigue, extreme weight loss, and cognitive issues such as depression, poor memory, or difficulty concentrating. And these effects aren't felt immediately. The health risks associated with B12 and iron deficiency, for example, take years to appear. So where does all this leave us? The information out in the wild is vast, Have I trawled through every study on meat and dairy and analysed the data? Of course not. Have I read every book on plant-based nutrition? No chance. Have I watched every documentary advocating or debunking veganism? No. The truth is, I'm not a dietitian, I'm not a nutritional scientist, and I'm not a doctor. In fact, I have absolutely no connection to the world of nutrition whatsoever. I write software for a living. So why should you listen to me? Well, you don't have to. I'm not here to give you diet advice or tell you how to live your life. I'm simply presenting the science as I have found it, and I could very well be wrong, but the science that I have found indicates that there is not enough evidence to conclude that animal products are harmful. Much of what we've been led to believe, from the health risks of saturated fat to the carcinogenic nature of red and processed meat, is based on observational studies. In the cases where RCTs have been conducted, the results have been either inconclusive or proved the opposite. There have been a handful of RCTs on vegan diets specifically, though most conclude that more data is needed. Plus, these studies follow specific vegan diets. As we've established, veganism is a diet of limitation, not recommendation. So it's only worth thinking about the impact of giving up meat and dairy when we're thinking about whether or not a vegan diet is healthy. Based on this, the idea of veganism as a healthy alternative to the omnivore diet implies that all animal-based products are harmful, which science indicates is far from true. Our bodies need certain vitamins and minerals such as zinc, iron and B12 that are simply more readily available in animal products than they are in plant-based foods. A vegan diet must be carefully planned to ensure sufficient quantities of this stuff. A vegan can't just swap out meat for non-meat alternatives and call it a day. At the very least, vegans need to consider supplements and fortified foods. Science is not possession of the truth, as Dr. Klurfeld puts it, but is the systematic, reproducible pursuit of the answers. And we should depend on reliable science for dietary recommendations. And in my opinion, the current science criminalizing meat and dairy is anything but reliable. Vastly more research is needed. But even if there isn't enough research to incriminate meat and dairy, should we just assume it's safe? Probably not. We as a society should continue to research the long-term impacts of meat and dairy, as well as other foodstuffs such as meat-free alternatives. Even if we have ate meat for thousands of years, we shouldn't continue to do so just because that's what we've always done. Logic and science should dictate our diets, not tradition. Reasonably, you might think that this account has been particularly biased, and you're right, to be honest. I do have a bias. I'm actually biased towards veganism. I wish there was evidence that meat and dairy was harmful, and that a person could not only survive, but thrive when eating a plant-based diet. Why? Because there are so many other good reasons to go vegan. We know that methane gas, for example, produced by cows and animal manure, as well as major deforestation undertaken to provide the land for herding cows, is a major contributor to climate change. And while the ethics around eating meat is contentious, I truly believe that most people would be hard-pressed to defend the factory farming approach that treats animals not as living creatures, but as products, sending them down a conveyor belt of slaughter. Yes, I do wish that the third reason, our health, was a justifiable reason to make the switch to veganism. Unfortunately, I'm not so certain. Like I said, I have no intention whatsoever of giving dietary advice, but as it stands, it looks to me that meat and dairy still has a place in most healthy diets, albeit ones that are largely plant-based.